Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
Tonight, we are very lucky to have another guest with us. Most recently, we had John Ridge, who is from the NATO Innovation Fund. And I think tonight's guest is a particularly interesting, as it were, follow-up, where last time we heard a bit about how European governments are investing in a venture capital fund to change the way they think about investing in technology. And today's guest that I met, I virtually met after the We Have Ways Festival, had just written a book, and I thought that was a really interesting connection. Before we go there, though, Gareth, as always, you're in a very exciting looking location. What is your dramatic, exciting and secret location tonight?
I'm in Folkestone. Very glamorous. I'm down here for a week, but I'm doing some work around decision making with a company down here.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'm going to introduce the guest we have tonight, and I'll do that with the formal bio, so you'll excuse me as I look at my notes and get this right. We are very lucky to be joined tonight by Dr. Matthew Ford, who is an associate professor in war studies at the Swedish Defence University in Stockholm. Matthew's work has ranged from analysis of military innovation to considering the representation and conduct of war on the digital battlefields of the 21st century. And where I first came across Matthew was when he was at the We Have Ways Festival this year, and he was talking about his book, which is called War in the Smartphone Age. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Matthew earned his PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College, and he's been a visiting scholar at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey and is a West Point Fellow. He's currently an associate of the Imperial War Museum Institute in London and an honorary historical consultant to the Royal Armouries in Leeds, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and a senior non-resident fellow with the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Prior to academia, Matthew worked for the consulting divisions of PricewaterhouseCoopers and IBM and was a strategic analyst at the UK Ministry of Defence. What drew me to email Matthew and to have him kind enough to say he'd come and talk about it was, as I read his book, I couldn't help feel, but I was reading the modern equivalent of the kind of work that was done between the First and Second World Wars, when Guderian started to develop ideas around blitzkrieg. Little Hart talked about mechanized warfare. Nimitz talking about and then leading the revolution that came in naval warfare. And Matthew's looking a bit embarrassed at me saying that, but it was this idea of warfare and ideas evolve. And as human beings, we naturally stick to what we know. And I was listening to some podcasts around the First and Second World War. And of course, in the First World War, people still thought cavalry was a jolly good idea. And of course, it's this getting past that. So Matthew's book was all about challenging that thinking and starting to introduce these new factors. So absolutely fascinating. And the thing about it that was also interesting to me was the book is a really tremendous way. And just before we came on, Matthew said, well, honestly, Chris, it's really a history of what has just happened. But what I think Matthew did particularly well was connecting these ideas together in ways that perhaps just if you read the news wouldn't do. But I was also struck by the fact that I don't know the conversation is over, as in it felt as I was reading the book, there's more chapters and more books to be written. Anyway, after all of that introduction, Matthew, welcome to the podcast and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you both, Chris and Gareth. It was a real pleasure. Your effusive email asking me to come onto the pod was more than enough. I go on other pods and sometimes I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this because I kind of realize I have to do it. But actually, it was a real pleasure to get invited and to come and join you. I'm pleased I did enough at the We Have Ways Fest to persuade you that you might actually want me on. So I'm hoping that I can carry on in the same vein. With that in mind, I have got a whiskey on the go. I know it's only a Tuesday, but it's been a long week already. So I'm hoping that the whiskey will ease my tongue a little bit and we can have a good conversation.
Well, I like it because it hopefully that talks a little bit to what kind of a podcast we have where a glass of whiskey is de rigueur. I don't know. Do you have a drink in your hotel room, Gareth?
I don't, but I'm definitely going to go and have a glass of wine after this recording.
Well, look, let's kick off. I've talked a bit about the fact that you've just written this book, and that's kind of what got us started. But as always, just before we came on, we talked about other work you've been doing. But the book is War in the Smartphone Age. Why don't you talk at a high level what the book is about and what you mean by how the smartphone and our always connected world is currently in the middle of changing the way we do war?
So I think it's fair to say that the book was born out of a sort of general sense of frustration about trying to make sense of what I was seeing on my phone. I mean, I was on social media, I was on socials looking at stuff, and, this stuff comes at you out of context without any chronology. So you just sort of get an image dropped into your timeline, and there you are having to try and make sense of it. And I had to give a podcast with my co-author on my second book, which had come out in March 22, and we had to give a podcast on the US Marine Corps. And there's nothing like giving a talk in front of a bunch of hairy-ass Marines and thinking to yourself, if I get this wrong, I am definitely going to be shredded. So I kind of spent that month trying to sort of understand how wrong we were when I wrote Radical War with Andrew Hoskins, the book I just finished. And that involved me just looking at social media and looking at mainstream media and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And as I was looking at that, what I realized was that actually the stuff that we'd written in Radical War was had a lot more going for it than we realized. But that wasn't to say that there wasn't a lot more happening even as we were sitting there watching. There's a whole, for the last War in the Smartphone Age, is sort of me thinking about what I'd written before in Radical War and trying to make sense of that in the context of, enormous events like the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And indeed, dare I say it, the October 7th attack and what was going on in Gaza. But actually, what happened is as I started talking to people about Radical War, all sorts of other conversations happened with people who were working in the Sahel, in Somalia, in other parts of the world, where the sort of things that I'm talking about in terms of the digital, how the internet is on and wars are fought, even though the internet is on, doesn't get switched off. That stuff was everywhere. And to my surprise, really, we weren't actually talking about it. And what was even more surprising, I think, was just that the conversations that I was hearing about involved mainly a discussion around how AI was going to revolutionize things. And certainly in the last year or so, that kind of discussion has really taken off. And there I am looking at the technologies that make everyday life possible through the infrastructure that makes AI possible is the same infrastructure that makes it possible for you to use your smartphone. It's cloud compute, it's base stations and fiber optic cables. It's the same sorts of people involved in these sorts of technologies. And yet the thing that we weren't talking about, the mundane thing that actually makes our lives possible, the smartphone, where everyone's life. I mean, if I said to you now, do you have a smartphone? You go, well, of course. Do you know anyone who doesn't have a smartphone? I mean, it's so mundane. We so take it for granted. And yet, that bit of the piece gets forgotten. And yet, at the same time, we're talking about how AI is going to revolutionize things. And I'm kind of thinking, well, hold on a minute. Why don't we just try and understand why we are where we are before we start thinking about how AI is going to change everything? And to be honest, what I realized was that War in the Smartphone Age was that opportunity to sort of just set out a history of the present, really. Why is it that we are seeing all these odd pictures and images of war on our phones? And what does it imply, both in terms of our involvement and our participation and our engagement and our attention, but also in terms of how wars are fought? And, shouldn't we pay a bit more attention to that?
So I think it would be easy. When we're on our game, we talk, as the podcast is meant to, about leadership and management and all sorts of associated things. You could easily be forgiven for saying, well, hang on a minute, this sounds like a very technical conversation about the way the military works. What drew me to this was we have talked a lot about changing scenarios and managing and leading in times of change. And what this struck me was we are literally living in the middle of this. And so therefore, understanding this change makes it easier for us to understand how other people are or aren't adapting. And I think the point of your book is many militaries are starting to adapt, but that I think is an ongoing thing. And I was just struck, I think it was yesterday I read that the Israeli military have said you are only allowed to have Apple phones now. And I presume, I'm making an assumption, this is because they feel they are more secure. But isn't that interesting that a military is starting to dictate what personal phones they've got? But anyway, let's go back to you talked about Ukraine, and one of the aspects of the book talks about the historically wars were fought by militaries and civilians were caught up or casualties or marginally involved. One of the really interesting tenets of your book is how this idea of who is a combatant and who isn't is radically changing. Can you give us one or two examples from Ukraine or from Gaza, perhaps, about how actually that is actually starting to blur, perhaps in more ways than we might imagine?
So I think the first thing to say is that there's been for, I don't know, as long as there have been the laws of armed conflict, a conversation about the extent to which civilians and the military, combatants and non-combatants, how blurred that distinction is. Where do you draw that line? Who could be targeted and who can't be? Right. So I'm not trying to suggest that in some way the technologies I'm talking about, that this is a new debate in some way, shape, or form. Right. What I am trying to point to is how these technologies have sort of physically embedded that blurring, right? Because everyone has a smartphone, and the technologies we're talking about, civilian technologies that we're talking about, they remain on. So the internet doesn't go down during a war. I mean, it does on occasions. I mean, for all sorts of particular specific reasons that might be related to, shutting off power supply, or that something's being targeted, or there's been a cyber attack, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for the main, for a government to switch off the internet is for a government to destroy its economy, right? So you can't afford to turn the internet off. I mean, it's just as simple as that. I live in Sweden. Everything is done is cashless. I don't think I've ever seen a Swedish banknote. So if you turn the internet off, basically nothing will work, right? I mean, literally nothing. I mean, I know the government tells us to carry 3,000 crowns with us as a sort of reserve, but I don't know anyone. Well, maybe the very goody two shoes Swedes will have. So the changes that we're talking about are really that the internet stays on, and the military then find themselves operating in a civilian context. And now we need to start thinking not that the military own this space, but that the military are interlopers in a space that's already there. And then we start to realize that the military themselves are needing to take advantage of civilian communications infrastructure, principally because military communications infrastructure isn't very good. And so you have to sort of piggyback off civilian comms. And so you've got this sort of physical enmeshing, as it were, of civilian and military comms. And that's understandable, because for me to go and buy a new piece of kit, it's easier just to go down to an Apple store and buy a new phone. Whereas the armed forces, and clearly you can spend a lot of time talking about reform of innovation processes and procurement processes and all the rest of it. But even if you reform it, the idea that you might get something into service within a year or so strikes me as being maybe, right? So it's possible, but it doesn't. You're pushing water uphill, I think. Now, that's the sort of context in which we're talking about these things. Now, if you then find yourself in a battlefield where civilians have got smartphones, then they are just easily part of the reconnaissance. They are literally just filming stuff as people go past. And they can do that incidentally, but they can also do it in an organized fashion. And they can do it in an organized fashion in such a way that they contribute anything that they record directly to the intelligence community, so that then the intelligence community can fuse that information, that intelligence, with other sources, and then you develop an even stronger picture of what's going on the battlefield, which then means that you've identified targets and all the rest of it. But of course, in the process of using your phone to record something and uploading that to an intelligence fusion cell, you are making yourself, or potentially turning yourself, into combatant. And so just from a soldier's point of view and the rules of engagement point of view, you've got this situation where the civilian is recording you, and they might be just recording you because, how many times do you see an armored column moving down the road? And this is really rather remarkable. We're going to record this. Or is it about actually passing on some information that would then be useful from a military perspective? Now, on the one hand, you can say that civilians have always been involved in this, right? So, in Afghan civilians, kids were, what's the British military policy? They're dicking to spot the movement of a patrol, and that allows the Taliban to organize an ambush and and that's not different. You can say the same throughout history, that some of these things have regularly happened where civilians have been involved in passing on information that's militarily useful. What you're talking about here is that this happens at a speed and scale on the basis of mundane devices that everyone has, that is, I put it to you, rapidly changing how, it's not rapidly, it has just changed the dynamics that armed forces are facing when they go into somewhere that might be deemed hostile. I mean, can you be sure that the person that's got a phone in their pocket is just going to be friendly or foe? There's no way of telling. But here's the rub, right? So on the one hand, civilians can directly participate. They can just take images of things and pass it on. But the fact that they have their smartphone on them in the first place creates a data footprint. And if you can grab that bit of data, then effectively you can understand at a meta level where people are on the battle space. And you can start to see patterns of behavior which you can track in and of itself. A smartphone is a remarkable device for gathering metadata, and it's also a remarkable sensor in the form of a microphone, phone, camera, and LiDAR and GPS and all these other bits and pieces. Now, for those armed forces like Hamas are particularly good. They understand that implies that everyone has a smartphone. What we need to do is encourage everyone to be involved in propagandizing what we're doing. So one of the key things that they did was to create the conditions in which Israelis would then broadcast their own atrocity, right? So they would go and kill someone, but they didn't have to propagandize themselves. They didn't need to use their own smartphones to propagandize things. They could rely on Israelis to do it for them. And in many ways, that was much, much more powerful than if they had done it themselves. And so I put it to you that the technology we're talking about here has sort of revolutionized participation in conflict in a way that I think the armed forces and society and actually our legal frameworks can't quite comprehend or apprehend. And so it might be easy to wrap this up as hybrid war, but actually what we're talking about is the drawing together how media works and how conduct of war works. So we've got a relationship between media and war that's always existed, but is sort of the Venn diagram has overlapped really tightly now because the device becomes both the means by which you broadcast images of war, but also broadcast actually what's going on in terms of intelligence. It's not just that you're broadcasting stuff on social media, but you're also collecting intelligence for potentially military purposes.
If ever there was change happening in front of our very eyes, and I think you put it very well in terms of there's always been, I think it was the American Civil War, where a woman would put washing out to say where the enemy was going to go. But the difference now is it's every single person. It's not just one person on a hill, it's every single person. As you've looked at this, and you give lots of fabulous examples of Ukraine, and you make reference to the fact there are apps that Ukrainians are encouraged to download. When a missile flies past, they open the app and say, I've just seen a Shahed fly past, and people can track things. You've given examples, Hamas, you've given other examples as well. When you see militaries adapting to this, I can imagine the big problem is everyone goes, someone should think about this and deal with this. And everyone then looks at each other because everyone knows who deals with tanks. Everyone knows who deals with guns and petrol. But the idea of who deals with the smartphone stuff and it feels like Hamas as an example you gave. And actually the book goes into, frankly, quite graphic detail about how they use it to great effect. What evidence have you seen? Who's dealing with this change? How are the militaries managing this change?
I think they're mainly useless.
Okay.
I mean, with all due respect to folks in uniform, I think they're mainly useless. And I think that's understandable. Actually delivering kinetic effects onto the battlefield is a complex and dangerous thing. And that requires careful orchestration of various kinetic levers in order to make sure that, put simply, we don't kill our own folks, right? The point is to do damage to the bad guys, not to us. And for understandable reasons, then we need to implement very clear and strict and careful protocols and doctrine and all the other bits and pieces. And of course, then that becomes the means by which we think about conflict. but also then that becomes the means that constrains our responses to what's going on in terms of society and socio-technical change, right? So what I'm talking about is that the changes that are going on are out in society, really, and they're not actually subject to military control. And that and the problem then becomes how to sort of sequence that back into a technical exercise in delivering kinetic effect when, as you rightly say, there are specific people responsible for specific things. And of course, I mean, if I think about it in military culture terms, if you're in doing information operations, you've not got as much kudos and status as if you were
Right.
door kicking in the SF community, right? So you kind of if you're a door kicker, you know, if you want to get on in life and become chief of the general staff, you go, I don't know, Sandhurst Guards, Special Force, Parachute Regiment, SAS. You know, I can see. I'm thinking of previous CGSs, and they do some door kicking, and then they turn up doing some operational stuff, and then you know they're CGS. But if you end up doing information operations, and I say end up because I think it's important. I'm not discounting in any way or trying to suggest that it's any less important, because I think it's even more important than the armed forces typically credit in terms of status. You know, you can see that becomes an add-on rather than a core task. Core task is we need to take out this bridge because this will produce this effect, which we can then instrumentalize in order to deliver campaign outcome. It's not what's the story we need to tell about this bridge as we take it down, other than as a strategic communication, we're delivering this message so you understand what it is. And that's not quite the same as, well, everyone's online and we have a participative media environment and it's not strategic communications we're talking about, because everyone actually online is taking a piss out of strategic communications and going, well, what cloud cuckoo land are those people on? Because it doesn't fit. You know, we can see what's going on. Someone's recording the bridge and the bridge is still there. Why are they still going on about this bridge in a particular... I'm elaborating, but you get my drift, I hope.
Well, it feels like the problem is almost bigger than the military, and this is overly simplistic. Perhaps the military haven't yet adapted as well as they might wish to this new world.
Is this not just a microcosm of a wider challenge in society, that the connectivity of the internet and the fact that we carry a suite of sensors, but also a device that delivers 24-hour, I was going to say news feed, but it's not. It's just information feed. It's not curated news at all. It's just stuff.
It's just vomit.
Yeah. So this is a massive challenge for the military. And you very articulately alluded to the blurring of lines between it being a surveillance asset, being a media asset, being a propaganda asset, being an intelligence asset, like all of these things that the civilian gets dragged into in conflict. But this is the same for the police in the fighting crime. This is the same for politics with maintaining free and fair democratic elections. This is the same for marketing companies. So is this a microcosm of a much wider societal shift?
It absolutely is. You're absolutely bang on, Gav. I mean, you know, people trying to make sense of the relationship between horizontal, top-down mainstream media, legacy. I'm going to use the Trumpian phrase, legacy media, which I can't help it because it just appeals to me no end. You know, this is legacy media is where all of the lefties and the woke and the progressives hang out. But the real media, the stories, are being told by people who have their phones and see the world as it is, right? This is an honest representation of the world. And so you've got this challenge between what an establishment view, a top-down view might look like, and then this horizontal participatory media environment where everyone and his dog can contribute, and everyone and anyone, you know, there is no expertise. All expertise is flattened amongst the crowd. Everyone has something valuable and useful to say. And if you were there, you can be a witness. And as a witness, your view is just as equal as the expert. And so now you're in a situation where the dysphoria, as it were, the churn, that's the phrase that someone like Andrew and I would use. The dysphoria and churn of experiencing online is that place where top-down legacy media meets participatory media, and you're in a constant sort of washing machine of how do I make sense of what I'm seeing? the mainstream media is telling me one thing, and yet online we're getting these different stories about how the world is. In there is it's for anyone who's trying to deliver military violence, political violence, is an absolute field day of opportunity to produce kinds of all sorts of effects that that can be exploited politically. I mean, and Hamas, in my mind, understood that the power of participatory media is so much greater than legacy media. The problem with the armed forces, and I gave a talk to M&C Saatchi a few months ago, and it was about EUCOM, and they regularly framing things in terms of top-down media. We want you to understand this about what we're doing. And fair enough, because there are messages that need to be conveyed. And it's not like, but at the same time, and of course, to do a sort of black information operation where you're seeding the ground and you've got, social media accounts out there already waiting to bubble up and sort of try to shape the news story by hashtagging and influencing, and then sort of taking things from the edge of the social media to the mainstream and then back again. You can do all of that, of course, but that requires, I don't know, people with cultural understanding, people who understand the platforms that they're working on, people who actually understand much more than the armed forces tend to educate people for, because, it's a place where groupthink reigns. And that is entirely understandable. But as an in culture, it's fine. But as a sort of, let's understand the complexities of human beings, and there are 10 billion of us, and we're all doing odd things, that's not going to be easy for any organization to do, let alone people in uniform.
Well, just explaining for our listeners what we mean by black psyops. So there's black, grey and white. White psyops is where you're releasing information as the military organisation or the government. So you're being very transparent about what you're saying and who you are. Grey psyops is where you're releasing information, but in a slightly more ambiguous context. So you're not saying where this information is coming from. Black psyops is where you are releasing information and purporting that it is coming from somebody else. So it is very much part of deception and, as you say, seed in the ground. So just clarifying what you meant there.
We should take a quick break, but I've got a furrow in my brow, and my opening gambit when we come back is, I think we're all screwed, and then I'll qualify why I think we're all screwed. I want to reframe this as, while this is a conversation about technology and about the evolution of devices in our relationship, this is change management. Our leaders, we are participating in this ourselves, and the leadership, whether it be civilian or military. How do you get a handle on this when, going back to the point we were saying, we're kind of good at the things we know about and we're not very good at the things we don't know about? So let's come back in a second. See you after the break. I think we're screwed. This is so difficult. The point I'm going to make is, we can't even manage our own social media. Never mind the military. Today, I can't guarantee the information that my kids are receiving or I'm receiving. And so the idea that now the military has to, in inverted commas, control this in some form seems unlikely, to say the least. Then there's a flip side that says, okay, and we should talk about that. Whether am I being pessimistic, or actually is that reasonably realistic?
Yeah.
Then there seems to be another flip side, which is, if I was in the military, this seems like this is the best it's ever going to be, where I can convince people that black is white and white is black. So I don't know.
It's a really interesting, I have this conversation a lot about deception, and people saying, oh, well, there's no point doing deception because, there's sensors everywhere and the transparent battle space. Well, that's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Because there's sensors everywhere, you can feed information everywhere, but you have to think about it differently to the old-fashioned way of just, I'm gonna have a dummy in a trench. That's my deception plan.
So that's a fruitful, there's a fruitful jumping off point into this next part of the conversation, I think. I mean, on the one hand, social media is a distorting prism in and of its own self. So you've got plenty of scope for diverting and creating opportunities for misrepresenting what's going on. But also, as I sort of alluded to in Modern Smartphone Age, the technologies that make all of these things possible are unevenly distributed because we're not thinking about the infrastructure landscape, the stack, as I described it because we're not thinking of that as the operating environment. We're still thinking in terms of bridges. And we're not thinking in terms of information flows. Because we're not thinking about information flows, we can't think about how. So I think the notion of the transparent battlefield is largely a misnomer. And I think that the software that we're spending an enormous amount of money on in terms of situational awareness software is only going to result in tunnel vision. And that tunnel vision is only going to be cause a problem in terms of, for people like yourself, Gareth, doing all these things somewhere down the lines. And then we will then get caught up in our own hall of mirrors as a result of the software that we ourselves rely on for driving our socio-technical targeting activity. So there's real danger. If we don't have people who can go back to the baseline, we will then end up several steps away from the baseline, and AI will complicate that process.
Yeah.
The result of which is that we will get further and further away from what it is that's actually happening. And so
I was going to say, is this a classic? It's trying to establish the signal from the noise. I mean, what I'm hearing is with all of this stuff, this is fantastic, and then all of a sudden, fantastic blurs into an awful lot of noise. That's social media today, and then the challenge is going to be, how do we extract the right bits? How do we understand that picture? I mean, we talked about the bridge. I'm just thinking, but I could make an AI picture of that bridge being destroyed, and I could tell everyone, oh, you hit the bridge and you made it, and while you go off and try and hit another bridge, my tanks roll across it. So
that's right.
Is it as simple as signal and noise?
It is signal and noise. I mean,
well,
but from an intelligence community perspective, the choice is between creating more noise, in order to sort of disrupt and hide, and that seems like the obvious way to go. Or to sort of try and find other ways of locking people in, focusing on attention in a particular direction, in the hope that creates the necessary diversion. But that all implies, I think, we need to be more attentive to the technologies that are being put in place, because they become the lens through which we are witnessing what's happening. And the lens itself becomes a distorting prism through which we start to, it becomes a problem in itself. And the further we go from the analog, and I don't have a problem with going towards digital, but I do have a problem with relying on any one service provider as if they can provide the platform around which we will orientate and organize ourselves. What I have a problem with there is that the danger is that we end up relying on that technology in a way that we become lazy. And as we become lazy, we forget what it is that's going on underneath the hood. And as we forget that, then we get ourselves into real problems.
So you mentioned the stack earlier, and I was particularly taken in the book about the description of the stack as a way of conceptualizing the link between the underlying infrastructure and the technology and the behaviors and the information flows. And you've just talked about or mentioned the idea of being too lazy to look under the hood. We've talked on this podcast quite a lot about the idea of systems thinking, and it strikes me that the stack gives you a really good model for starting to make links between really physically tangible things, bridges, infrastructure, cell towers, server rooms, information flows that are kind of virtual, and the way people think and behave. Can you just explain a little bit more about what the stack is and how that might be a slightly better approach to understanding the problem?
From my point of view, it's everything from human-machine interface, so that point where you're looking at the software, the operating system on your smartphone, and the way that is geared to shape your engagement with the applications on your phone. The hardware itself on your phone, so there's software and hardware engineers working to keep the phone in your hand and for you to constantly look at it, because that's how they can commoditize your engagement with the technology, all the way down through the app developers, the app stores, the commercial side of that process of identifying, finding, acquiring, and then understanding what people are buying, under what circumstances, why they're downloading these sorts of apps. So that whole marketplace of things, it gets very, very busy. This is very at the point of B2C kind of spaces. But then there's sub-order sets of challenges around B2B, about business to business kinds of, the infrastructure that makes the app possible, that, you can start to commoditize some of those things, all the way down to software engineers and the secondary markets around people having an idea and then the software engineer just sort of coming up with quickly building an app, and all of those sorts of people, all the way down from there to actually the infrastructures that itself maintain the cloud and how cloud compute works. But, you could go all the way down from there to the fiber optic cables, the satellite low Earth orbital satellite comms, the GPS grid, all the way, if you want, all the way down to the electricity grid itself. As a way, all of these things are sort of are effectively complicated and complex systems of systems that are socio-technical. An academic word would be socio-technical assemblages. They are just a relationship of different things that come together to make it possible to deliver a particular service or practice. And they have, for all sorts of obvious reasons, different relationships to each other that also have power relationships. So one company might be what does ownership of a cell phone network look like in Somalia compared to ownership of a cell phone network in the Sahel compared to a cell phone network in France? The ownership models in Somalia are fundamentally different to the ownership models in France. In Somalia, there is no working state beyond Mogadishu or Puntland or Somaliland. So then it's about who owns the mast. Who owns the mast? Well, the mast is owned by a clan, maybe. But who provides the infrastructure? Well, it's a telecoms company that a series of clans have clubbed together to bring into and then put in place for 5G communications technology. None of that is necessarily regulated by a state. In fact, Somali telecommunications infrastructure is some of the most advanced telecommunications infrastructure in the world. E-commerce, e-money, was invented in Somalia. It wasn't invented in Silicon Valley. The Somalis needed to figure out how to do remittance trades between their families in their diaspora families all over the world and what was going on downtown in Mogadishu, right? So for understandable reasons, they had a bit of Western Union, but they also figured out how to make the software work to allow them to move money between themselves. Now, people in defense, when I was working in the Ministry of Defense in 2008, 9, 10, we were talking about that. We were talking about how cell phone technology leapfrogs copper wire communications, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And yet somewhere down the lines, I think, we've kind of forgotten why that's important, right? And it is important because it's sort of shaping the latencies in networks, who can communicate what, information flow. The truth of the matter is that you can get information quicker if you're in London than if you were trying to communicate in Newcastle, right? And that's just a function of fiber optic cable grid laydowns between, literally between London and Newcastle. And you could say, well, that's milliseconds. And fair enough, it is milliseconds. But, that great book, was it Flash Boys? Was it by...
the trading times, milliseconds matter.
The milliseconds matter for trades way back in the 2010s. Right? When we're talking about war at the speed of data, those milliseconds count.
So my supposition just after the break was we're screwed. And the reason why I'm going to have to go and have a stiff drink after this is you've outlined brilliantly, Matthew, you've brilliantly outlined the scale of the problem and the fact that I think it's fair to say it's almost crept up on us. So we've said, and you said earlier, the military probably doesn't do as good a job as it should have done. I think you said not a very good job of managing all of this. So here is this huge opportunity, this huge risk that is not well understood. I don't think this is finished yet. We haven't reached the end of the Industrial Revolution that we can look back and say, how did it work? But here's the thing. I can't imagine how you start to get your hands around this, because the problem is the slippery eel is massive. Where are you going to start? So I'm going to be really unfair. And for once, I'm going to be unfair as much to Gareth as I am to you, Matthew. here is this problem that is facing the militaries and, frankly, civilian governments. Where do you start? Given the fact that people are spending little to no time on this at all, we are positing, I think very validly, that this is a massive risk. A massive risk. You go to Ukraine, and I suspect they are putting their hands around this and going, we need to solve this because this is meaningful about where we are. Massive problem. Can't solve it all. Can't see it all. Can't understand it all. Where do you start? How do you start to feel where the elephant in the room is? I don't know. This is almost worst case. How do you manage change? It's First World War. Apparently cavalry doesn't work anymore. We're going to spend the next 2 years slaughtering thousands of people to try and figure out what this new war means. Where do we start in this new world?
I think we've talked about this before. I think the first thing is you don't try and solve this as a single problem. This isn't a top-down revolutionary change to the way that we run organizations or the way that the military is organized and run, because we're not going to be predictive enough to get it right that we can just design a new system. This is about cultivating a new system rather than designing and building. So this is complexity at its greatest. This is about not knowing the cause and effect until you've played with it, till you've had feedback, till you've learned. You learn by doing. And so this is as much of a cultural change as it is a technical or a procedural one. What we're seeing in Ukraine is a really good example of that. We're seeing, little grass shoots, green shoots of brilliance, but we're also seeing lots of catastrophic failures. And the trick is not to put all your eggs in one basket and hope that that is one of the successes. The trick is to reinvest in the things that are working. Learn by rapid evolution rather than trying to top-down design and do some sort of technical revolution.
By the way, it occurs to me we could scratch out this conversation, replace it with the word AI, and it's probably the same.
Absolutely.
But Matthew, what's your, I suspect you live and breathe this, and even when you're not living and breathing this, you can't help yourself. What, to some degree, I'm misrepresenting. Gareth's statement was, you don't create a new unit, you don't create a new team, you don't build a new thing. You go to all the people that exist today and say, here is this problem. You need to think about this problem, and it needs to become the next bullet point on the things you do. What's your take on this?
So I think it's a great question, because I don't think actually we've got our heads around what I've been calling war in the smartphone age. So already we're moving to war in the AI age, right? So we don't understand the present. We're about to replace the present with some future that we don't actually have any sense of or can't really get our heads around. And it's multiplying and compounding our misunderstandings of the present in ways that sell us false solutions for what we don't understand.
You're not helping, Matthew. You're supposed to come and give brilliant answers, and you're making me even more worried than I was.
So
I mean, I agree with you.
We've got organizations that are going through rapid processes of change, or have been told that they must go through rapid processes of change. And we've got officers who understand their business and who are effectively being told that they need to rethink how they do their business to incorporate AI in some way, shape or form. And yet the AI almost certainly won't do everything that they think it does. And if it does make it look all shiny and whatever, then you have to think carefully, like you would with any LLM or any other use of AI software. You have to be an expert in the first place to be able to interpret what it is that you're seeing. And if you're in the process of implementing this technology, actually going to then get rid of your experts because you don't actually need them in the same way that you did before you had this technology, then effectively you have all of the right conditions in which we then end up tunnel vision-like, believing what it is that the software is telling us and not critically engaging with what it is that we are looking at from a system, from a baseline point of view. So we are in serious danger from a change management point of view. And my background is absolutely like yours in change management. I am absolutely thinking, if I was working at PwC or IBM now, on the one hand, the pressure would be on to sell all of this AI stuff at you all. But on the other would be how do we move people from the as is to the to be in a way that doesn't destroy expertise? And I don't think I'm hearing anyone talking about how to maintain, sustain, and develop expertise in such a way as it would make it possible to actually keep control over these AI technologies. So not only do we not understand the present, we are going rapidly ahead, pushing rapidly ahead on a bunch of technologies that we don't understand either. And in the process, we're killing off our experts. And if that's not a recipe for complete and utter disaster, I don't know what is. And so I absolutely sit there scratching my head as I listen to the latest pronouncement from the Ministry of Defence or from Pete Hegseth talking about how Palantir is going to revolutionise everything. And I don't begrudge Palantir and Anduril making profit and all the rest of it. But I absolutely do begrudge the idea that somehow they understand the military business better than the armed forces. And I just don't buy it, to be honest.
So are we saying that we need to get to the I think it's the trough of disillusionment in the hype curve before we go on the path to whatever it is? In other words, are we saying it has to go horribly wrong before we'll take it seriously enough to make it right? By the way, I think that happens a lot naturally, but...
So, what I'd say is that from an academic point of view, I answered the question from an organizational perspective back then. And I think that there's real danger for the organizations, right? For the armed forces, for the people who work in the armed forces. And again, just to emphasize, I have a lot of time respect for people who are pushing the AI agenda. But, they're pushing it in a way that they understand it, but also they need to bring everyone else with them. And we also need to preserve all of these skills and whatever as we go. That's one organizational challenge. But from my point of view as an academic, the real challenge is to try to map some of these changes. And in that respect, I've been thinking about things in terms of mapping the stack. Now, that is an inordinately challenging thing to do because the levels of complexity and systems of systems that we're talking about are such that it's, that's not something that can be done in any scale using AI itself. This is something that actually requires empirical research. And it requires people to spend some money on it. If I wanted to understand the Somali telecoms grid, and ownership models and how people engage with Somali social media and what kinds of social media is important and what's not, how WhatsApp features in clan behaviors, how that shapes warfighting, I actually need to do some ethnography. And there's no easy route around that. You just actually have to spend the money, take the time, and go and investigate how people live in digital contexts in the times of war. Now, does anyone in government, the research councils, or in academia want to go and do that work? Of course they don't, because it's not a simple, quick fix. It requires money, time, effort. We've got AI telling us what the answers are going to be, and blah, 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 blah. So, but we have to start with building blocks that we understand and work our way from the history of the president, as I framed it, towards whatever a baseline might look like, and then work towards from there the step on in terms of the step on from there to sort of mapping the stack in more comprehensive ways.
I guess I'm feeling yes, it feels like we're starting to get a little bit of an answer here, which is there is a cultural piece. There is a research piece. It just feels like it's a really hard thing to do. And I think you said it very well. I can imagine when you say we can either spend this money on ethnographic research, or we can spend this money on this snake oil salesman said, if I spend this money, all the problems that we don't quite understand will go away. Actually, as human beings, we like the shiny, we like the photo op, but I don't know. I think it's such a hard one to get your head around. But perhaps a slightly different question. And I don't know. This is where I love these conversations, because I'm trying to figure out what are even intelligent questions. This feels like when people built battleships, there was a point at which we built battleships for a few years. We know how they work. We can now talk intelligently about battleship tactics. We can talk about how we build them. We kind of know the rules of the game. All the pieces are on the board. And while the pieces move around a bit, we know the rules of the game and we can be useful about it. Artillery, another really good example in the First World War. We know how to do that now. We can apply it to war and we can move forward. It feels to me a little bit like the pieces aren't all on the board and we don't know the rules. I'm going to say this even if I don't believe it. Is there going to be a point at which everything slows down and we say, okay, we can take a deep breath, now we can work it out? Or is it literally the pieces are now perpetually moving?
I suppose this is the underlying reason for writing War in the Smartphone Age is that we're in a battle between the private sector and big tech and sovereign states. And sovereign states, we hear people talking about digital sovereignty. And yet the technologies that make digital sovereignty possible are global and transnational in nature. So, we're talking experts in Silicon Valley might be contracted through Silicon Valley, but they might not be located anywhere near Silicon Valley, right? So we have a virtual workforce of smart people who are producing code that ends up in software that sort of makes it possible to manage a series of systems in a part of the world that has been contracted. Somehow that somewhere down the lines we might say, well, we've got a contract with you to deliver this in this particular location, and all your software and hardware needs to be in this location. And yet you're like, well, hold on a minute. All the people that have made the software, all of the companies that are in the supply chain are transnational in some way, shape, or form. And yet we are going to claim that the state can somehow determine, dictate, or direct what's going on contractually. And of course, states can do that up to a point. But what you're watching is, I think, a battle between effectively big tech and sovereign governments. Now, from a US point of view, there's not a problem, right? They have a sovereign tech capability. It's in Silicon Valley, and everyone in the rest of the world, mainly, apart from China, apart from maybe Russia to a lesser extent, maybe, Israel, they use that software and the applications that Silicon Valley provide. And so if America decides that it wants to switch something off or regulate something or, it doesn't like how social media is working, then it can choose to do that. And all we can do is pass a law saying you have to comply with, being 18 or whatever. But if those organizations, those companies don't want to do that, they don't have to do that. They can choose not to do that. And to be honest, the technology is evolving in such a way that they don't even need to do it, right? You can get round the blocks that the firewalls that sovereign government might put in place via virtual private networks. Elon currently has a low Earth orbital satellite network that relies on base stations in a local country so that you can speed up the connections between satellite and the ground station. But equally, you could just bounce the signals across satellites to a ground station where he has sovereign control, and he could keep broadcasting whatever he wants into a country, irrespective of whether the country says it likes it or not. And so you've got the technologies that the Americans have are such that it doesn't matter really what sovereign governments say, think, like, want, legislate for, or whatever. And we can kid ourselves that a regulatory approach will change this infrastructural relationship, but it won't. And unless we acquire our own infrastructures that make it possible for us to do these things for ourselves, and let's face it, that is not going to happen anytime soon, there is no way that we can maintain some kind of sovereign control that allows us as a country to dictate to big tech how the world is. Elon can broadcast as much as he likes about how Britain will be in a state of civil war, and there is absolutely nothing that the British government can do to stop him.
Wow, this is a cheery conversation at best. I mean, as you were talking as well, it became clear to me that we've been talking in terms of sovereign countries moving forward their agenda. I don't know whether that projecting power, deciding what they want to do. The more we talk about this, the more the concept of sovereign nations is starting to blur around the edges.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. And we're handing power to those tech
that's the
companies.
Point. It's not just that the tech companies. it's not like just they can get around and do things. It's that the power starts to shift to them.
Right. And when we do that in relation to the armed forces, so we give crucial situational awareness command and control infrastructure away to these companies, what we're doing is hollowing out the state's legitimate control over the use of armed force within its geographical. The fundamental things about what a state can do are that it controls military power within a geographical space. But if because you haven't paid up your subs, your key communications command and control infrastructure goes down, effectively you're in hock to big tech. And that is, in my view, a real problem. As a British citizen, the British government handing this power over to a tech company is, it's much worse than Lammy getting rid of jury trial for criminal cases. Talking fundamentally changing, that creates the conditions in which the state becomes an adjunct to big tech, where big tech says, you will do this, otherwise we'll switch this off. And the state goes, all right then.
So maybe as a last question, and this is both fascinating, terrifying, and not satisfying in that we don't have some pretty simple answers for how we solve this. But last philosophical question, what you've described very well over the last hour is an enormous change in terms of the dynamics of power in the world, both between the civilian world and sovereign nations and the military, in terms of tech companies and sovereign nations, in terms of how we do things that we assumed we knew how they worked. How did we get to this point where it feels like we've sleepwalked into it? And maybe the example is, I came into this, if you'd have asked me separately and say, what do you think about social media? And I would say, I'm really worried about social media because I don't know how we got to this point where social media has such an impact on how people think and behave. This feels like that argument, but on steroids. Why didn't we see this coming? Why, and perhaps more usefully going forward, why is it we don't see this as urgently as perhaps we should, that it is the threat, a very real threat that we have just talked about?
A smartphone is a very, very beguiling technology, right? Our engagement with this technology has gone up from, I think I did some stats for Warren Smart. I can't remember the specific stats, but, whereas in 2020, we might have been online on our smartphone for 3 hours and 30 minutes a day. Now, the average American is online for 4 hours and 30 minutes, something like that. You can find, if you buy the book, you can find the specific reference. I can't remember it. But the point is that these technologies are sticky, and they're designed to be sticky. We are actively participating in our own surveillance. Why do we actively participate in our own surveillance? Because we get all these benefits. Life has moved online because we've incentivized to move online. We buy our stuff at a cheaper price because it's online. It's more convenient to go to work and be able to do the shopping as we go to work. It's more convenient to do banking in a particular way, or to buy a mortgage, or to get a taxi. These things are beguiling, and we get suckered, and our lives have moved online. And in the process of us transferring our lives online, we have also transferred an enormous amount of data into the hands of those who can leverage that data for the benefit of generating, AI software. We are the data. We are the ones that are producing the data that is driving the training models. We're the rabbit. We're the hamster in the wheel that's producing the data that makes it possible for the AI software to perfect itself. And we're not producing enough, right? So we've already got a situation where the AI platforms have run out of data. The AI companies have run out of data, and they want us to produce more. So they're going to push us into being online even more. And as we do all of that, we transfer more and more power away from ourselves, because we're doing it unthinkingly. Where there's no regulatory. I mean, the closest we get is GDPR in Europe, which the UK still subscribed to in legislation terms. But of course, that's under an enormous amount of attack from big tech. You could say, well, GDPR is getting in the way of innovation. And of course it is. But what kind of innovation are we talking about? And what kinds of, is it sovereign to us? No, it isn't. To actually create the sovereign capabilities we're talking about requires an enormous amount of time, energy, and effort, and no one gives a toss.
There was the last hour. There's been so much in there from a leadership and management perspective. I think we can abstract away the typical lessons. Don't take anything for granted. One of the things you've mentioned multiple times is the core skills that we have will always continue to be important. And in fact, when we rely too much on this technology, they'll be even more important at some point. I don't know whether to go away from this conversation depressed or excited about the future. I'm going to say excited because I'm frankly going to be, look, Matthew's nodding about being excited, but there's a huge amount
more
to learn.
Opportunity for us, more opportunity for doing good work and research and figuring out. I mean, I love it. There's more opportunity to do more research,
Well, and the other thing as well is it has to come down to a group of people to figure this out. And I think that to me is maybe that was the depressing bit, which is you said it so beautifully that the technology is so beguiling, it is encouraging us not to look at it too deeply. That's the real problem we've got. And there's lessons there for leaders to say, that thing you really like, are you really thinking about should you like it as much as you think you do? Anyway, lots going on. I will finish off by saying you should absolutely go and buy Matthew's book, War in the Smartphone Age. As I said, it is a really good read. There's loads of stories in there which I think bring some of the conversations we've had to life, but I heartily recommend it. And it's always nice because whenever you interview an author, I suspect the author's nervous about, has this person I'm speaking to actually read my book? I can assure you I actually have. And it was interesting. I was listening to Gareth, who I lent the book, and sometimes he doesn't get a chance to read it. He's busy with other things. I could hear him talking about specific pieces of your stack. So there's another good sign that he was reading all of that. So that's excellent. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for giving up the time. Really, really, really appreciate it. As ever, if anyone has heard something today which has stimulated thought, please email us. We are on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. And of course, we'd love to hear if you violently agree, if you violently disagree, or if you just want to generally send rude comments to myself, or indeed Matthew. We'll happily pass those on as well. We are on X and Blue Sky. Sorry, I had to think about whether I called it X or Twitter today, at Battling with Biz with a Z. If you have listened to this and you like it, please go ahead and subscribe. And that way, every Thursday, you'll get an episode of Battling with Business that will appear in your inbox. And the bit that personally I'm most interested in is, if these conversations are interesting, go find a colleague or a friend and have, even if they don't listen to the podcast, I don't worry about that as much. Go have these conversations. And today's conversation, I think, comes under the heading of these are the kinds of conversations we should be having, whether it's about AI or whether it be about smartphones in this new age of warfare. But for now, I'll say thank you very much. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Gareth has disappeared off into ether as well, but he says thank you. And I hope you enjoy the last of your whiskey as well.
Thank you very much to you both for having me on. It's been good fun, and I appreciate the chance to chat.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And we'll see you next week on Battling with Business.